In a city where power often shields corruption, one woman stands as a beacon of integrity. Emily Reed, a determined internal affairs investigator, has dedicated her career to exposing those who abuse their authority. But when a routine lunch break turns into a confrontation with an arrogant officer, Emily finds herself unraveling a conspiracy far greater than she imagined. With every step deeper into the case, she uncovers layers of deceit, betrayal, and a web of corruption stretching from the police force to the city's elite. As threats escalate and allies falter, Emily must decide how far she's willing to go to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. What begins as an investigation into one officer's misconduct transforms into a battle for justice that puts Emily's career, her safety, and her resolve to the ultimate test. The sun shone brightly over the streets of Brookside, a suburban enclave outside a bustling city. Emily Reed's black SUV reflected the sunlight as she drove toward her favorite lunch spot. It was rare for her to take a break from work, but the morning's meeting at the Internal Affairs office had drained her. Her team had been poring over case files, unraveling allegations of misconduct within the city's police department. The weight of the cases, many involving vulnerable communities, gnawed at her. Emily, in her mid-30s, carried herself with a composed confidence. Her tailored blazer and sleek ponytail conveyed professionalism, but her heart often bore the exhaustion of battling a flawed system. She had risen through the ranks of internal affairs with grit and integrity, her sharp instincts earning her a reputation as someone who never backed down. But the cost was high. Her modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood offered little solace. She spent most nights surrounded by stacks of paperwork and cold takeout containers. As she cruised through Brookside's tree-lined streets, jazz music filled the car, providing a momentary escape. She thought about the fried chicken she planned to grab for lunch, a small indulgence she rarely allowed herself. But her peaceful moment shattered when the flashing red and blue lights of a squad car lit up in her rearview mirror. With a sigh, Emily pulled over. She checked her license and registration in the glove compartment, her badge tucked neatly beside them. Experience told her this stop was not about a traffic violation. The officer approached with an aggressive swagger. Tall and broad, he radiated hostility even before he tapped sharply on her window. His nameplate read, "Officer Grant Simmons." "License and registration," Simmons barked. Emily handed them over without a word, watching his expression shift as he scanned her documents. His frown deepened, and he leaned closer to the window. "This car doesn't look like it belongs to you," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. Emily's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" "Step out of the car," Simmons ordered, ignoring her question. Emily knew better than to argue on the street, but her patience wore thin. She opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. Standing tall, though dwarfed by Simmons' bulk, she met his gaze with calm resolve. "Why am I being stopped?" she asked evenly. "Your license and registration do not match the description of this vehicle," Simmons said, his hand resting on his belt. "This car is way too nice. Looks stolen to me." Emily raised an eyebrow, her voice firm. "Did you run my plates?" Simmons hesitated, caught off guard. Instead of answering, he snapped, "Turn around and place your hands on the car." Emily held her ground. Slowly, she reached into her blazer pocket, pulling out her internal affairs badge. Simmons' face went pale as he saw it. "You might want to rethink your tone," she said sharply. "I am Agent Emily Reed, Internal Affairs, and you, Officer Simmons, are treading on very thin ice." Before Simmons could stammer a response, another squad car pulled up. A middle-aged man with a calm yet authoritative presence stepped out. Sergeant James Carter approached, his sharp gaze shifting between Simmons and Emily. "What is going on here?" Carter asked. Emily crossed her arms. "Your officer seems to believe I stole my own car. Care to explain?" Carter's eyes hardened as he turned to Simmons. Officer Simmons? Simmons stammered. I thought— She has her license, registration, and badge, Emily interrupted. This is profiling, plain and simple. Carter nodded curtly. I will handle this, Agent Reed. You are free to go. Emily did not move. I hope you do handle it, Sergeant. This is not the first complaint I have heard about Simmons, and it will not be the last. As Carter led Simmons away, Emily returned to her car, her hands trembling slightly. This was not the first time she had been unjustly targeted, but the blatant nature of Simmons' actions stirred an anger she could not shake. Back in the driver's seat, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The fried chicken no longer appealed to her. Instead, she drove home, her mind racing with thoughts about how to pursue justice. At her apartment, Emily sat at her small dining table, surrounded by case files. The confrontation with Simmons played over and over in her mind. Her phone buzzed. Another complaint had come in about a different officer. Her shoulders slumped. Just as she was about to dive back into work, a knock at the door startled her. She hesitated. Visitors were rare. Opening the door, she found her neighbor, Mrs. Clara Jennings, holding a tray of cookies. Emily, dear, Mrs. Jennings said with a warm smile, I noticed you came home early today. Thought you could use a little treat. Emily blinked, caught off guard. Oh, Mrs. Jennings, you did not have to. Nonsense, the older woman said, brushing off the protest. You work too hard. I do not know what you do, but it seems important. Take a break, for goodness sake. Emily managed a small smile. Thank you. That is very kind. Mrs. Jennings lingered, her gentle presence soothing. She asked Emily about her work, and for the first time in weeks, Emily allowed herself to share. She spoke vaguely about her role, avoiding sensitive details, but Mrs. Jennings listened intently. You know, Mrs. Jennings said thoughtfully, the world is not as kind as it should be, but people like you can change that. Her words lingered long after she left. Emily found herself thinking about the small gesture of kindness, a tray of cookies, a few minutes of conversation, and how it eased her burden, even if just a little. The next morning, Emily returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. She called her team together, laying out her findings on Simmons. As they strategized their next steps, she realized that while the fight for justice was daunting, she was not alone, and she would not back down. Chapter 1. The Pullover. Emily Reed's day had started like any other. As the head of internal affairs in the bustling city of Chicago, her mornings were consumed with back-to-back meetings. Her office was sparse, but meticulously organized, reflecting her disciplined personality. Files documenting years of cases sat neatly on a shelf behind her desk, a reminder of the countless battles she had fought to expose corruption within the force. It had been a grueling morning. The latest case involved complaints of excessive force and racial bias by several officers under review. Emily's team was at a crossroads, debating whether they had enough evidence to proceed. The tension was palpable, but Emily, as always, kept her cool. At noon, she decided to take a rare lunch break. Sliding into her black SUV, she allowed herself a moment of calm as she pulled away from the precinct. A stack of case files sat in the passenger seat, untouched since the morning meeting. Jazz music filled the car, softening the edges of her otherwise sharp focus. She planned to grab her favorite fried chicken from a local diner, a small indulgence in a life otherwise defined by order and restraint. As she cruised through a quiet neighborhood, Emily noticed a squad car parked along the curb. She thought little of it until the squad car pulled out, following her at a distance. Her jaw tightened when the lights flashed behind her, signaling her to pull over. Sighing, she complied, pulling to the side of the road. She watched in the rearview mirror as a tall, stocky officer approached her car with deliberate steps. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon, and his expression carried an unsettling mix of arrogance and nerves. "License and registration," he demanded, tapping her window aggressively. Emily rolled down her window and handed over the requested documents, saying nothing as he inspected them. His frown deepened. "This car doesn't look like it belongs to you," the officer said, his tone tinged with suspicion. Emily tilted her head, her patience already wearing thin. "And what exactly does that mean?" "This is a nice car," he said dismissively. "It looks stolen to me." Emily stared at him, her frustration bubbling beneath her composed exterior. She had seen this behavior before, the subtle, coded language used to justify racial profiling. "Step out of the car," he barked. Emily hesitated but complied, opening her door and stepping out with the quiet authority that had carried her through years of law enforcement. She stood before him, her tailored blazer and polished demeanor starkly contrasting his antagonism. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," he ordered. Instead, Emily reached into her pocket, moving slowly. His hand shot to his gun. "Do not move another inch," he yelled. Emily froze, then calmly pulled out her badge and held it up for him to see. "Special Agent Emily Reed, Internal Affairs," she said firmly. "And you, Officer Simmons, are one bad decision away from a misconduct report." The color drained from his face. His hand dropped from his weapon as he stumbled over his words. "Wait, what?" he stammered. Emily stepped closer, her voice cutting through the tension. "Did you just racially profile me, Officer Simmons?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Before he could respond, another squad car pulled up. A middle-aged man in a crisp uniform stepped out, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Sergeant Carter," Emily said, without looking at him, keeping her eyes locked on Simmons. "Are you going to explain what is going on here?" Carter glanced between Emily and Simmons, his brow furrowing. "What is this about, Officer Simmons?" I thought she looked suspicious," Simmons mumbled, his confidence crumbling. "Suspicious because my skin color does not match my car?" Emily asked pointedly. Carter's expression hardened. "Simmons, my office. Now." The young officer hesitated, then retreated to his squad car, his head hanging low. Carter turned to Emily, his tone apologetic. "Agent Reed, I am sorry for this. I will handle it personally." Emily crossed her arms, her gaze unyielding. "This is not the first complaint I have heard about Officer Simmons, and I doubt it will be the last. Your precinct has a pattern of behavior that needs addressing." Carter nodded, though unease flickered in his eyes. "Understood. I will take care of it." Emily watched as Simmons's car sped off, his lights still flashing. She turned back to Carter. "If Simmons escalates another situation today, that is on you," she said, her voice steely. Carter seemed ready to argue but held his tongue. "You are free to go, Agent Reed," he said finally. Emily returned to her car, her mind racing. She had dealt with officers like Simmons before, men who wielded their power irresponsibly. But something about this encounter felt different, more personal. As she drove away, her resolve hardened. She would not let Simmons off the hook. This was just the beginning. Emily's neighborhood was a pocket of calm in the bustling chaos of Chicago. Her home, a modest two-story brick house with ivy crawling along the sides, was her sanctuary. Its interior reflected her personality, minimalist but warm, with soft tones of cream and gray. The walls bore few decorations, save for a shelf of books and a framed photo of her late mother, whose strength had always inspired her. After the exhausting encounter with Officer Simmons, Emily had driven home in silence, her jazz playlist forgotten. Her thoughts circled back to Simmons' arrogance, Carter's vague apologies, and the lingering sense that the incident wasn't isolated. The tension of the day clung to her as she parked her SUV in the driveway, grabbed the files from her passenger seat, and walked toward her front door. As she climbed the steps, Emily noticed a figure standing by her porch, a petite, elderly woman with a kind face framed by short silver hair. "Emily, dear," the woman said warmly. Mrs. Jennings, Emily replied, surprised to see her neighbor. Is everything all right? Mrs. Clara Jennings smiled and held out a small tray. I baked cookies. Thought you might like some after a long day. You looked a bit tired when you left this morning. Emily blinked, caught off guard. She couldn't recall the last time someone had done something so simple, yet thoughtful for her. Her job often made her feel like an island, disconnected from the everyday kindness of others. That's very kind of you, Emily said, accepting the tray. Mrs. Jennings' blue eyes sparkled as she adjusted the wool cardigan draped over her shoulders. Oh, it's nothing. Just my way of saying thank you for everything you do. I know your work isn't easy. Emily felt her chest tighten. How did you know what I do? Mrs. Jennings chuckled. You're a detective, aren't you? I saw you in the newspaper a while back. Something about cleaning up corruption in the force. We need more people like you, Emily. Emily didn't know what to say. She managed a faint smile. Thank you, Mrs. Jennings. I appreciate that more than you know. Well, don't stay up too late, Mrs. Jennings said, patting Emily's arm. And if you need more cookies, you know where to find me. With that, the older woman turned and shuffled back across the street. Emily stood on the porch for a moment, holding the tray of cookies and letting the unexpected kindness settle in her chest like a warm glow. Inside, she set the cookies on the counter and sank into the worn leather armchair in her living room. The day's events played out in her mind like a relentless loop, but Mrs. Jennings' gesture had softened the edges. She picked up one of the cookies and took a bite, savoring the buttery sweetness. It reminded her of home, of the afternoons spent baking with her mother, who always said that small gestures of kindness could change the course of someone's day. Her mother had been right. Later that night, Emily dove into the files she had brought home. Simmons' personnel record was thin, but several complaints of excessive force and racial profiling had been filed against him over the years. Each one had been dismissed or quietly resolved. The reports bore signatures from Sergeant Carter, whose name kept surfacing in connection to questionable incidents. Emily frowned. Something about Carter's responses felt off, too neat, too rehearsed. Her instincts told her he was hiding something. As the hours wore on, she began piecing together a troubling pattern. Simmons wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger network within the precinct, one that operated with disturbing impunity. Emily was deep in thought when a soft knock at the door startled her. She glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Frowning, she stood and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. Unease prickled at the back of her neck. She opened the door cautiously and looked around. The street was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights. Just as she was about to close the door, she noticed something on the porch, a folded piece of paper. Emily picked it up and unfolded it, her stomach tightening as she read the words written in bold, blocky handwriting. Drop the case, or you'll regret it. Her heart thudded in her chest. This wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Emily stepped back inside and locked the door. She stood in the entryway, staring at the note, anger rising to the surface. Whoever had left this thought they could scare her into silence. They didn't know her at all. The next morning, Emily brought the note to her team at Internal Affairs. Her second-in-command, Detective Adam Walsh, studied it with a grim expression. Looks like someone doesn't want you digging any deeper, Adam said. Good, Emily replied. It means I'm on the right track. Adam sighed. Emily, you need to be careful. If this is coming from inside the precinct, you're dealing with people who have a lot to lose. I know, Emily said, her voice steady. But that's exactly why we need to keep going. Adam nodded, his respect for her resolve evident. All right, let's dig into Simmons and Carter's connections. There's got to be more here. Emily spent the day following the threads of her investigation, each one leading her closer to the truth. Carter's name appeared in financial records linked to a real estate developer, Mason Hale, whose projects had displaced entire communities under suspicious circumstances. The implications were staggering. That evening, as Emily packed up her files, her phone buzzed with a message from Adam. Got a lead. There's a community meeting tonight at 8 p.m. Residents are talking about intimidation by officers. Thought you might want to check it out. Emily texted back. On my way. The church basement was packed. Folding chairs lined up in tight rows were filled with residents of the neighborhood, their faces a mix of frustration and quiet resilience. The air buzzed with tension, punctuated by the hum of an old ceiling fan. Emily stood at the back, blending into the shadows, listening as person after person shared their experiences with the police. They rolled up to my uncle's store, said he didn't have the right permits, an older man said, shaking his head. He's had those permits for years, but they made such a scene that customers stopped coming. He had to close down. A woman in her 30s wiped tears from her face. They've been parked outside my building for weeks. It's like they want us to feel like criminals, just for living there. Emily's pen moved steadily across her notepad, jotting down every detail. These weren't isolated incidents, they were a pattern of harassment, targeting minority neighborhoods. She could feel the weight of the stories pressing down on her. Then a voice cut through the noise, a teenager's voice, clear and defiant. My name's Jaden, he said, standing from his seat near the front. He was tall and lanky, with a red hoodie pulled over his head. I've got something to say. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. Jaden's voice trembled, but grew stronger as he continued. We were just playing basketball at the park last week. My friends and I. Then one of them, Officer Simmons, rolls up and starts yelling at us, says we're causing trouble. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He didn't ask any questions, didn't care what we were doing. He just started threatening us. Jaden's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. I've seen how they treat us, like we don't belong here, like we're nothing. Emily's heart clenched. She knew the pain behind those words all too well, but what Jaden said next made her pulse quicken. Thing is, one of my friends was recording the whole thing, on his phone. The crowd erupted into whispers, but Emily stepped forward, her voice firm. Jaden! He turned, startled by her presence. The room went quiet again as everyone realized who she was. I'm Emily Reed, she said, meeting his eyes. I'm an internal affairs investigator. If you have evidence, I can use it to hold Simmons accountable. Jaden hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I can get the video for you. Later that evening, Jaden handed Emily the video outside the church. She watched it on his phone under the flickering streetlight. The footage was shaky, but damning. Simmons loomed over Jaden and his friends, his hand resting on his gun holster as he barked orders. His tone was laced with disdain, and at one point he muttered, Kids like you are why we can't have nice neighborhoods. Emily's stomach churned. She had seen enough. Thank you, Jaden, she said, her voice steady. This is going to help. The teenager shrugged, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of hope. Just don't let him get away with it. I won't, Emily promised. The next morning, Emily met with her team, the body cam footage playing on a loop in the conference room. This is it, Detective Adam Walsh said, leaning forward in his chair. This proves everything we've been suspecting. Emily nodded. We need to act fast. If Simmons knows we have this, he'll try to cover his tracks. And Carter might help him. Adam frowned. Do you think Carter's in on it? There's no doubt, Emily replied. His name keeps showing up in the complaints, and he's been signing off on all of Simmons's incidents. He's protecting him, maybe even orchestrating this whole thing. Adam glanced at the door, then leaned closer. We need more than this video. We need to follow the money. There's always a trail. Emily's phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from an unknown number. Watch your step. Her jaw tightened. Looks like someone doesn't like how close we're getting. Adam's brow furrowed. You should be careful, Emily. If this goes all the way up to someone like Carter, they're not going to play nice. Emily pocketed her phone. They can try to intimidate me all they want. We're not backing down. That evening, Emily sat at her desk, sifting through financial records tied to Carter. The deeper she dug, the more connections she uncovered, links to Mason Hale, the real estate developer. Payments disguised as consultation fees flowed from Hale's accounts to Carter's over the course of several years. Emily leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Hale wasn't just some developer. He was using the police to intimidate residents out of their homes so he could buy the properties at rock-bottom prices. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her office door. She looked up to see a man in his 30s, dressed in a blazer and holding a notepad. "Emily Reed?" he asked. "Yes," she said cautiously. The man stepped inside, offering his hand. "Ben Turner, journalist with the Chicago Chronicle. I've been following your work, and I think I can help." Emily studied him for a moment before shaking his hand. "What kind of help?" Ben smiled. "I've been digging into Mason Hale for months. I've got sources who can confirm his connections to Carter and Simmons. If we work together, we can bring this whole thing down." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but this stays between us. No leaks until we have enough to take them down." "Understood," Ben said, his expression serious. As the night wore on, Emily and Ben pieced together the puzzle. The web of corruption extended far beyond Simmons and even Carter. Hale's reach was vast, and his influence over the precinct had allowed the abuse to go unchecked for years. Emily felt a surge of determination. She thought of Jaden and his friends, of Mrs. Jennings' quiet kindness, of the countless people whose lives had been upended by this corruption. This wasn't just about bringing down Simmons or Carter. This was about restoring trust, about showing the community that someone was fighting for them. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Emily stood in her kitchen the next morning, her fingers wrapped around a mug of black coffee. The city outside her window was beginning to stir, the hum of life faint but steady. Her mind, however, was already deep into the investigation. The night's revelations had been both illuminating and overwhelming. The corruption she had uncovered wasn't just about Officer Simmons, it was a systemic rot, orchestrated by Carter and tied directly to Mason Hale's real estate empire. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Ben Turner. "New lead. Carter is meeting Hale this afternoon at 3. I have the location." Emily responded immediately. "Send it. I'll meet you there." As she prepared for the day, she couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had settled over her. This wasn't just another case, it was bigger, messier, and far more dangerous. But it also felt personal. She had spent her career rooting out corruption, yet this was the first time she felt like the enemy was actively watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. At 3:00 p.m., Emily and Ben parked a block away from the restaurant where Carter and Hale were set to meet. The building was upscale, with large windows overlooking a quiet street. Ben had a small camera hidden in his coat, ready to capture anything incriminating. "Are you sure about this?" Ben asked as they watched the entrance from their car. Emily nodded. "We need to see who else is involved. If Carter's meeting Hale here, they're likely discussing something important." A few minutes later, they spotted Carter stepping out of a black sedan. His expression was tense as he walked inside. Moments later, Hale arrived, his tailored suit and confident stride a stark contrast to Carter's nervous demeanor. Ben adjusted the camera, ready to record. "This feels big." "It is," Emily replied, her voice steady. "Let's see what we can get." Inside the restaurant, Hale and Carter sat at a secluded table near the back. From their vantage point outside, Emily and Ben could only see glimpses of their faces through the large windows. Ben captured what he could, zooming in on Hale handing Carter a thick envelope. Carter took it quickly, glancing around nervously before tucking it into his coat. Emily's jaw tightened. "That's a payoff," she muttered. Ben nodded. "No doubt about it, but we'll need more than this to make it stick." As they continued observing, Carter leaned forward, his lips moving quickly. Hale smirked, nodding as if satisfied, Whatever they were discussing, it was clear they were confident in their scheme. That evening, Emily and Ben reviewed the footage in her living room. The envelope exchange was damning, but without audio, they needed more. Ben sighed, leaning back on the couch. This proves a connection, but we still can't tie it to the real estate scheme. We're close, Emily said, her tone resolute. If Carter is this deep in, there's gotta be a paper trail. We just need to find it. Ben looked at her, his expression serious. Emily, you know this isn't just about Carter or Hale anymore. This goes deeper. There's no telling how high up this might. No, she said quietly. That's why we can't stop. Next morning, Emily arrived at with soft. He had been working tirelessly. Financial records laid, and their persistence had finally paid off. Detective Adam Walsh met her at the door, holding a stack of papers. We found something, he said, leading her to the conference room. On the table were printouts of transactions from Hale's real estate company. Several payments, labeled as consultation fees, had been funneled to Carter over the years. More troubling, there were similar payments to other officers in the precinct, including Simmons. This is it, Adam said. This tie them all together. Emily studied the documents, her mind racing. The payments were irregular, but consistent enough to establish a pattern. Hale wasn't just bribing Carter. He was buying the precinct's silence, ensuring his harassment campaigns went unchallenged. Her phone buzzed with another text from Ben. Residents meeting tonight at 7. More stories of harassment. I'll be there. Emily replied, See you there. That evening, Emily and Ben attended the community meeting at a local rec center. The room was smaller than the church basement, but no less crowded. The air was heavy with frustration, but also a shared sense of solidarity. Residents stood one by one, recounting their experiences with police intimidation. The stories mirrored what Emily had heard before: officers showing up unannounced, accusing people of fabricated infractions, and creating an atmosphere of fear. One woman, Maria Torres, shared how her family had been forced out of their home after weeks of harassment. They said we were violating zoning laws, she said, her voice shaking. But we weren't. They just wanted us gone. My kids still ask why we had to leave. Emily felt a pang of guilt as she listened. The system that was supposed to protect these people had betrayed them, and she had to make it right. After the meeting, Maria approached Emily. I heard you're investigating this, she said hesitantly. I am, Emily replied. I'm going to make sure this stops. Maria's eyes welled with tears. Thank you. I don't know if anyone's ever said that to us before. Emily placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. You deserve better. We all do. As Emily and Ben left the meeting, Ben turned to her. Do you ever wonder if it's enough? If all this work will really change anything? Emily looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Every time I hear someone's story, I wonder. But then I think about what happens if we don't try. If we let them keep getting away with it. Ben nodded, his respect for her evident. You're a better person than most. Emily smiled faintly. I'm just doing my job. The next morning, Emily sat in her office, her desk covered in files, financial statements, and the mounting evidence tying Mason Hale's operation to the corruption within the precinct. The previous night's meeting had weighed heavily on her. Maria Torres' story, along with the others, replayed in her mind like a broken record. Each account was another reminder of the human cost of the corruption she was fighting to expose. Families displaced, livelihoods destroyed, communities fractured. She had sworn to make things right, but the deeper she dug, the more tangled the web became. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Ben Turner. Got a lead. Someone from Hale's office wants to talk. Meeting at noon. Can you make it? Emily's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she replied. I'll be there. Where? Ben responded with the address of a small coffee shop in the West Loop. It wasn't far, but her gut told her this meeting wouldn't be simple. At noon, Emily arrived at the cafe. It was a cozy, quiet place tucked between two larger buildings, with warm wood accents and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. Ben was already seated at a table near the back, a cup in his hand and a manila folder resting on the table. As Emily approached, she noticed the young woman sitting across from him. She couldn't have been older than 30, with dark, tired eyes and a nervous energy that made her twist the scarf around her neck repeatedly. Ben stood as Emily reached the table. "Emily, this is Rachel Martin. She works as an executive assistant at Hale Enterprises." Rachel looked up, her expression wary. "Are you the one investigating him?" Emily nodded as she took a seat. "I am, and I understand you have information." Rachel hesitated, her fingers gripping the edges of her coffee cup. "I don't know if I should be doing this," she said quietly. "If he finds out—" "He won't," Emily interrupted, her tone firm but reassuring. "You're doing the right thing, and I'll make sure you're protected." Rachel looked down at her cup for a moment, then reached for the folder in front of her. "I've worked for Mason Hale for 3 years. At first it seemed like a good job, great pay, nice office. But then I started noticing things. Payments going to accounts that didn't make sense, conversations he'd have with people like Carter." She pushed the folder toward Emily, who opened it to reveal printed emails and spreadsheets. "These are just copying," Rachel continued. "The real files are on his private server at the office. I don't have access to all of them, but what I've seen is bad. He's paying off officers to scare people out of their homes. And it's not just Carter, it's a whole group of them." Emily scanned the documents. The emails were cryptic but damning, referencing payments and evictions in vague but undeniable terms. One subject line read, "Another block cleared. Payment pending." "These are incredible," Emily said. "But if we're going to take him down, we need those server files." Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee. "The server's in his office. It's encrypted, and only he and his IT guy have access. But I overheard Hale saying he's leaving for a business trip tomorrow. If there's ever a time to get in, it's when he's gone." Ben leaned forward. "How secure is the office?" "Very," Rachel replied. "Cameras everywhere, and security guards on every floor. But there's a small window when the guards do their rounds around 11:30 p.m. That's your best shot." Emily closed the folder, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Rachel, if you're willing, I'll need your help getting into that server, but I need you to understand the risks." Rachel met her gaze, her fear evident, but overridden by determination. "I've seen what he's done to people. I can't stay silent anymore. I'll do it." That night, Emily prepared meticulously. She contacted her team at Internal Affairs to cover her bases, ensuring the operation wouldn't compromise her investigation. She also arranged for Adam Walsh to be on standby, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. By 11 p.m., she and Rachel were parked outside Hale's office building, a sleek glass structure that loomed over the quiet street. Rachel's access badge got them through the front door, and they made their way to the elevators. Emily's pulse quickened as the elevator ascended. She wasn't new to risky operations, but this felt different. She was stepping directly into enemy territory, with no backup inside the building. When they reached Hale's floor, Rachel led her to a side hallway where the server room was located. The lights were dim, and the hum of the building's HVAC system filled the air. Rachel swiped her badge to unlock the door, and they slipped inside. The server room was a sterile, windowless space filled with rows of servers and blinking lights. Rachel moved quickly, typing commands into a terminal. "This will take a few minutes," she whispered. Emily stood by the door, her ears straining for any sound. Every creak of the floor or shift of air felt like a threat. Suddenly, Rachel gasped. "What is it?" Emily asked, moving to her side. Rachel pointed to the screen. "He has a file on you." Emily's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Rachel clicked on a folder labeled Read and opened a series of documents. They contained personal information, Emily's address, her career history, and even details about her family. He's been keeping tabs on you, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily clenched her fists, anger rising in her chest. Focus on getting the other files. We'll deal with this later. Rachel nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. After a tense few minutes, she transferred the files to a flash drive and handed it to Emily. We've got everything, Rachel said. Let's move, Emily replied. As they exited the building, Emily felt a wave of relief. They had the evidence they needed to take down Hale, but that relief was short-lived. A black SUV idled across the street, its headlights off. As Emily and Rachel climbed into their car, the SUV roared to life and began following them. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel as she navigated the streets, her heart pounding. Is that them? Rachel asked, panic creeping into her voice. Stay calm, Emily said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. We'll lose them. She took a sharp turn down a side street, then another, weaving through the maze-like neighborhood. Finally, the SUV disappeared from view. Emily exhaled slowly. We're clear, for now. Rachel nodded, her face pale, but determined. Did we get enough? Emily glanced at the flash drive in her hand, its weight symbolic of the fight ahead. More than enough. Emily barely slept that night. The files Rachel had retrieved were now locked in a secure drive at the Internal Affairs office. As dawn broke over Chicago, she sat in her office with Adam Walsh and her trusted IT specialist, Marcy, who was busy decrypting the data. Almost there, Marcy said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Emily sipped her coffee, staring at the computer monitor with laser focus. She didn't need much sleep anymore. Her mind was too consumed with what they'd find in those files. If Rachel's intel was right, they were about to uncover the core of Mason Hale's operation, a network of bribes, payoffs, and coordinated harassment campaigns designed to push vulnerable families out of their homes. Got it, Marcy said finally, the screen filled with spreadsheets, emails, and detailed reports. Emily leaned in, scanning the files. There were payments from Hale's accounts to Carter, Simmons, and other officers in the precinct. The amounts were staggering, labeled under vague descriptors like community outreach and operational expenses. More damning were the emails. Hale's casual tone about evicting residents was chilling. One email read, "Need that block cleared by next week. Carter's team is slacking. Push harder." Unbelievable, Adam muttered, shaking his head. Emily's jaw tightened. This isn't just corruption. This is exploitation. They're using their badges to terrorize people so Hale can profit. Marcy scrolled further and found another folder labeled Legal Strategy. It contained files outlining Hale's plans to suppress any legal complaints, including details about specific plaintiffs who had been intimidated into dropping their cases. Adam whistled low. They weren't just bribing cops, they were silencing anyone who dared fight back. Emily stood, her determination hardening. This is the smoking gun. We have enough to take this to the chief. It's time to put an end to this. Later that morning, Emily and Adam met with Chief Douglas in his office. The room was tense, the air thick with the weight of what Emily was about to present. Chief Douglas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. This better be good, Reed. You've stirred up a lot of noise with this case. Emily placed the flash drive on his desk. This isn't noise, Chief. This is the proof we've been waiting for. She walked him through the evidence, from the payments to the eviction emails, and finally, the legal suppression tactics. As she spoke, Douglas's face grew darker. When she finished, he leaned forward, his hands clasped. This is massive, but you realize what this means, don't you? I do, Emily said firmly. Hale's operation has corrupted a significant part of our precinct. If we don't act decisively, we risk losing what little trust the community has left. Douglas sighed heavily. All right, I'll authorize immediate suspensions for Carter, Simmons, and anyone else implicated in these files. We'll bring in Hale for questioning. Emily nodded, relief washing over her. Thank you, Chief. I'll coordinate with the task force to handle the arrests. By midday, the precinct was buzzing with activity. Word of the investigation had spread, and officers whispered in hushed tones as Emily's team moved to detain Carter and Simmons. Simmons was the first to be brought in. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a sullen defiance. Carter, however, put up more of a fight, arguing loudly as he was escorted into the holding area. "This is a mistake," Carter shouted. "You're going to regret this, Reed." Emily didn't flinch. She stood in the hallway, her arms crossed, watching as he was led away. "You've had your time, Carter," she said calmly. "Now it's over." That evening, as Emily and her team reviewed the logistics for Hale's arrest, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You think you've won? But it's not over. Walk away while you still can." Emily stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She had grown accustomed to threats, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about intimidation. It was a desperate attempt to scare her off before Hale's network completely collapsed. "Everything okay?" Adam asked, noticing her expression. Emily locked her phone and nodded. "They're getting desperate. That means we're close." The next morning, Emily led a task force to Hale Enterprises. The sleek, glass-covered building was a symbol of power and wealth, standing in stark contrast to the crumbling neighborhoods it had preyed upon. Emily's team moved swiftly, securing the lobby and making their way to Hale's office on the top floor. Hale greeted them with a smirk, leaning casually against his desk. "Agent Reed, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "You know exactly why we're here," Emily said, stepping forward. "We have evidence linking you to bribery, harassment, and illegal eviction schemes. Mason Hale, you're under arrest." Hale's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're making a mistake. I've got lawyers who will eat you alive." "Good luck with that," Emily said, as she signaled for her team to cuff him. As Hale was escorted out of the building, Emily felt a sense of triumph, but her victory was short-lived. Back at the precinct, Adam met her with a grim expression. "We've got a problem." "What is it?" Emily asked, her pulse quickening. "While we were arresting Hale, Simmons gave a statement implicating someone higher up. He says the precinct commander was in on it too." Emily's stomach dropped. "The commander?" Adam nodded. "And there's more. Simmons claims there's a file somewhere that outlines the commander's role. If it exists, it's probably in one of Hale's properties." Emily clenched her fists. The battle was far from over. Hale's arrest was just the beginning, and the web of corruption stretched further than she had imagined. Emily stood in the precinct's conference room, a map of the city spread across the table. Red circles marked Hale's known properties, luxury developments in wealthy neighborhoods, juxtaposed with foreclosed homes and vacant lots in marginalized areas. Detective Adam Walsh and IT specialist Marcy flanked her, their faces mirroring her focus. "If Simmons is telling the truth," Emily said, tapping one of the circles, "the missing file is likely stored at Hale's property on Westward Avenue. It's isolated enough to avoid attention, but still close enough for him to access quickly." Adam frowned. "That building's listed as a storage facility for his construction company. Security will be tight, especially now that we've arrested him." Emily nodded. "Exactly why we need to act now. If the commander's name is in that file, Hale's people will try to destroy it before we can find it." Marcy leaned over the map. "I can bypass most of their digital security, but physical access is another story. You'll need a team." Emily's phone buzzed. It was Chief Douglas. She answered, keeping her voice steady. "Reed," the chief said, his tone clipped, "I hear you're planning a raid on Hale's property. I hope you're aware of the risks." "I am, Chief," she replied. But we can't wait. If that file exists, it's the key to bringing down the entire operation. There was a pause before Douglas sighed. Fine. You've got authorization. Be careful, Reed. This is uncharted territory. By nightfall, Emily and a small team of trusted officers arrived at the Westward Avenue property. The building loomed ahead of them, a stark industrial structure with few windows and a chain-link fence surrounding it. Adam checked his watch. Guards do their rounds every 15 minutes. We'll have to time this perfectly. Emily adjusted her earpiece. Let's move. The team approached the building in pairs, using the shadows for cover. When they reached the fence, Marcy pulled out a small device and clipped it to the padlock on the gate. A soft click signaled the lock's release. Inside, the air was heavy with the hum of machinery. The team moved through the dimly lit corridors, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floors. Marcy stopped at a security panel near a steel door. "This is it," she whispered. "The server room's behind here." "How long?" Emily asked. 2 minutes tops," Marcy replied as she plugged a small device into the panel. Emily and Adam took positions near the door, scanning the hallway for signs of movement. Tension coiled in Emily's chest. Every creak and shadow felt like a threat. Marcy exhaled softly. "Got it." The steel door slid open, revealing a room lined with servers and filing cabinets. Emily and Adam entered, moving quickly. "Search everything," Emily said. Marcy began downloading data from the servers, while Emily and Adam rifled through the cabinets. It didn't take long before Emily found a folder labeled Strategic Partnerships. Inside were contracts, emails, and memos, each document more damning than the last. At the bottom of the stack, Emily found what they had been looking for: a detailed ledger connecting the precinct commander to Hale's operations. Payments were recorded meticulously, alongside dates and notes about coordinated evictions. "Got it," Emily said, holding up the ledger. Adam grinned. Finally, some answers. But the moment was short-lived. "Movement outside," Marcy hissed, glancing at a security feed on her device. Emily's heart sank as she saw 3 figures approaching the building, armed and moving with purpose. "Security's onto us," she said. "We need to go. Now." The team exited the server room cautiously, staying close to the walls. Emily clutched the ledger tightly, her mind racing. They had what they needed, but getting out would be another matter. As they reached the main corridor, the sound of heavy boots echoed ahead. "Split up," Emily ordered. "Marcy, take the data and exit through the east door. Adam, you're with me." Marcy hesitated but nodded, disappearing down a side hallway. Emily and Adam moved toward the west exit, their movements careful but swift. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with one of the guards. "Hey!" he shouted, raising his weapon. Adam reacted first, shoving the guard against the wall and disarming him in one fluid motion. "Go!" Adam barked, tossing the weapon aside. Emily led the way, her pulse pounding as they ran toward the exit. Behind them, more footsteps echoed, the guards in pursuit. They burst through the exit door into the cold night air. The team's van was parked nearby, its engine idling. Marcy was already inside, waving them over. "Get in!" she yelled. Emily and Adam dove into the van as the guards emerged from the building, shouting and firing into the air. "Drive!" Emily ordered. The van sped away, leaving the guards behind. Emily leaned back against the seat, clutching the ledger to her chest. "That was close," Adam said, his voice shaky. "Too close," Emily replied, her breath coming in short bursts. Back at the precinct, Emily and her team pored over the evidence they had retrieved. The ledger detailed not only the commander's role, but also the broader scope of Hale's network. Other officers, city officials, and even business leaders were implicated, their names recorded alongside payouts and actions taken on Hale's behalf. "This isn't just a precinct issue," Adam said, his voice grim. "This goes all the way to City Hall." Emily nodded, her jaw set. "Then we take it to the feds." This is bigger than us now. As the team began compiling their findings into a formal report, Emily felt a mix of triumph and trepidation. They were closer than ever to exposing the truth, but the risks were escalating. Her phone buzzed again, another message from an unknown number. "You should have stopped. You're out of time." Emily stared at the screen, her resolve hardening. Whoever was behind this thought they could scare her into silence. They were wrong. The precinct buzzed with activity the next morning, as Emily prepared to hand over the evidence to federal authorities. The sheer magnitude of what they had uncovered was staggering. Mason Hale's network extended far beyond the precinct, implicating city council members, business leaders, and even developers across the state. In the conference room, Emily stood before her team, a stack of files and a flash drive laid out on the table. "This is it," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "We have enough evidence to dismantle Hale's operation and hold everyone involved accountable." Adam Walsh leaned forward, his expression a mix of determination and concern. "You know this isn't going to end quietly. Hale's people won't go down without a fight." Emily nodded. "That's why we're handing this over to the feds. They have the resources to protect witnesses and ensure nothing gets buried." Marcy tapped at her laptop, pulling up a list of the implicated individuals. "I've flagged priority targets based on their involvement. If we act quickly, we can minimize the damage they try to do before they're taken into custody." Emily was about to respond when her phone buzzed on the table. It was Chief Douglas. "Reed," he said, his tone brisk, "we've got a problem. There was a break-in at your office early this morning. Looks like someone was trying to access your files." Her stomach tightened. "What did they get?" "Nothing, thankfully," Douglas replied. "The internal server locked them out, but whoever it was knew exactly what they were looking for." Emily's grip on the phone tightened. "Understood. I'll secure the files and get them to the feds immediately." "Do it fast," Douglas said, "and watch your back." Emily left the precinct that afternoon with Adam and Marcy as backup. The files were safely stored in an encrypted drive, but the weight of what they carried felt heavier than ever. As they approached the federal building, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her eyes scanned the street, catching glimpses of unfamiliar faces and cars that lingered too long. "Everything okay?" Adam asked, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. "Just stay sharp," Emily said, her voice low. They entered the building without incident, greeted by a federal agent who escorted them to a secure conference room. Over the next hour, Emily laid out the evidence for the federal task force, answering questions and outlining the scope of the investigation. When they finished, the lead agent, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair. "This is solid work," he said. "We'll move on this immediately, but you need to be prepared for the fallout. These kinds of cases tend to get messy." Emily met his gaze, her voice firm. "I've been dealing with messy my whole career. Just make sure these people face justice." As they left the federal building, Emily allowed herself a rare moment of relief. The evidence was out of her hands and in capable ones, but that relief was short-lived. As they crossed the parking lot, a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of them. Two men in plain clothes jumped out, their faces obscured by hats and sunglasses. "Get down!" Adam shouted, pulling his weapon as Marcy dove for cover. Emily hit the ground as the men opened fire, bullets ricocheting off the pavement. Adam returned fire, hitting one of the tires of the SUV. The men scrambled back into the vehicle and sped off, leaving a trail of smoke and skid marks behind. "Everyone okay?" Adam asked, scanning the area. "I'm fine," Emily said, picking herself up and brushing dust from her blazer. "Marcy?" "Shaken but okay," Marcy replied, her voice trembling. Emily's jaw tightened. The attack was a clear message. Hale's network wasn't going down without a fight. Back at the precinct, Emily convened her team in the conference room. The atmosphere was tense, the near miss weighing heavily on everyone. "This changed nothing," Emily said, her voice firm. We knew they'd push back. Now we push harder. Adam crossed his arms. What's the next move? Emily glanced at Marcy, who had been reviewing the files Hale kept on his associates. I've identified 2 key players who are still active, Marcy said, pulling up their profiles on the screen. One is Hale's head of security, a guy named Victor Monroe. The other is Councilman Gregory Downs. Both have significant ties to the eviction schemes. Monroe's likely the one coordinating these attacks, Adam said. If we can take him down, it'll weaken their ability to retaliate. And Downs? Emily asked. Public pressure will be key, Marcy replied. If we leak his involvement, he won't be able to hide behind his office for long. Emily nodded. Let's move on Monroe first. If we can cut off their muscle, it'll buy us time to bring Downs into the spotlight. That evening, Emily and Adam led a task force to one of Hale's safe houses, where Monroe was believed to be hiding. The building was a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusting fences. As the team approached, they spotted movement inside figures pacing near the windows, their silhouettes illuminated by the dim interior lights. Looks like he's got company, Adam muttered. Standard breach protocol, Emily ordered. The team moved in swiftly, breaking down the door and flooding the warehouse with shouts and flashing lights. Monroe's men scrambled to defend their position, but they were no match for the tactical precision of Emily's team. Within minutes, Monroe was in handcuffs, his face twisted in a mix of anger and resignation. You think this change anything? He spat as Emily approached him. It changes everything, she replied coldly. Back at the precinct, Monroe's arrest sent shockwaves through Hale's network. Marcy monitored the fallout in real time, watching as social media lit up with calls for accountability and reform. But as Emily reviewed the day's events, another message appeared on her phone. This isn't over. We'll come for everything you care about. Emily stared at the words, her resolve hardening. We're not stopping, she said quietly to herself. Not until it's over. The morning after Victor Monroe's arrest, Emily walked into the precinct to find a thrumming energy among her team. The arrest had been a critical blow to Mason Hale's network, and the ripple effects were spreading fast. Officers whispered in hallways, news outlets reported non-stop coverage of the corruption, and public outrage was growing. Adam Walsh met her near her office, holding a tablet. You need to see this, he said, leading her to the conference room. The team had gathered around a monitor, displaying a live press conference. Councilman Gregory Downs stood at a podium, his polished demeanor barely masking the strain beneath. I am deeply concerned about the recent allegations, Downs said, his voice steady but unconvincing. Let me be clear. I have always acted in the best interest of this city and its residents. Emily crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. He's trying to spin it. Marcy, sitting at the table, smirked. Not for long. I've been working with Ben Turner on a data dump. The files connecting Downs to Hale's eviction schemes are about to go public. When? Emily asked. Today, Marcy replied, tapping her laptop. By the time he finishes his speech, the truth will be out. Hours later, the story broke. Emails, financial records, and documents linking Downs to Hale's operation flooded the media. The councilman's name trended across social platforms, with demands for his resignation dominating the conversation. Emily watched the chaos unfold, her satisfaction tempered by caution. He won't go quietly, she said to Adam. We need to be ready for anything. By evening, Emily's instincts proved right. As she prepared to leave the precinct, Adam approached her with a grim expression. We've got a problem, he said, lowering his voice. Monroe isn't talking. He's stonewalling us, but I did some digging, and it looks like someone from our precinct tipped him off before the raid. Emily's stomach dropped. You're saying we have a mole? Adam nodded. Someone inside is still protecting Hale's people, and they're feeding them information about our moves. The words hit Emily like a punch. Trust was the foundation of her team, and the idea of betrayal from within was a blow she hadn't anticipated. "Do we know who?" she asked. "Not yet," Adam said, "but I have a hunch." Simmons was being uncharacteristically quiet during his last interview. "I think he knows something." Emily exhaled sharply. "Set up another interrogation with Simmons. I want answers tonight." In the interrogation room, Simmons sat slouched in his chair, his usual arrogance muted by weeks in custody. Emily entered the room, her expression cold and unyielding. "Officer Simmons," she began, placing a file on the table, "you've already implicated yourself in more than enough to guarantee prison time. But if you're hiding anything else, now's the time to come clean." Simmons avoided her gaze, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the table. "I told you everything I know." "No, you didn't," Emily shot back. She opened the file, revealing photos of the documents recovered from Hale's server. "These prove you were part of Hale's operation, but they also show there's someone else on the inside, someone you're protecting." Simmons glanced at the photos, his jaw tightening. Emily leaned in, her voice low and sharp. "Do you really think Hale or Downs will lift a finger to help you? You're expendable to them, Simmons, but if you help us, I'll make sure the feds know you cooperated." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Simmons exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "Fine," he muttered. "It's Carter. He's the one still pulling strings from the inside." Emily's stomach churned. Carter had been suspended pending investigation, but Simmons's confession meant he was still actively working to protect Hale's operation. "How?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the anger rising within her. "He's got people loyal to him," Simmons said. "Even off duty, they're still taking orders from him. They'll do whatever it takes to cover for him and Hale." Emily wasted no time. Back in her office, she gathered her team. "Carter's still in play," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "He's using loyalists within the precinct to sabotage us. We need to find out who's working with him and cut off their influence now." Adam nodded. "I'll start pulling communication logs and tracking unusual activity. If anyone's still taking orders from Carter, it'll leave a trail." Marcy chimed in. "I'll review security footage from the precinct. If there's been any suspicious activity near sensitive files, I'll find it." Emily's phone buzzed as she spoke. It was a text from Ben Turner. "Just got a tip. Carter is meeting someone tonight at the old Riverside docks. Might be worth checking out." Emily read the message aloud, her team exchanging tense glances. "It's a trap," Adam said immediately. "He knows we're onto him." "Maybe," Emily replied, "but if he's meeting someone, it's our best chance to catch him in the act. We'll need to move carefully." That night, Emily, Adam, and a small tactical team arrived at the docks. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and rust. The only sounds the distant hum of the city and the occasional creak of wooden planks. Emily crouched behind a stack of shipping crates, her eyes trained on a small office building near the water. The faint glow of lights inside confirmed someone was there. Through her earpiece, Adam's voice came through. "Two figures inside. Looks like they're arguing." Emily signaled the team to move forward. As they closed in, the door to the office burst open, and Carter stormed out, his face red with anger. The man he had been meeting with, a shadowy figure Emily didn't recognize, followed close behind, holding a briefcase. "Move!" Emily ordered, stepping into view with her weapon drawn. "Freeze!" Adam shouted, his team surrounding the area. Carter's eyes widened as he realized he was cornered. He raised his hand slowly, his defiance flickering even in defeat. "You don't know what you're doing, Reed," he sneered. Emily stepped closer, her voice like steel. "I know exactly what I'm doing." "Your time's up, Carter." Back at the precinct, Carter's arrest sent shockwaves through the department. His loyalists, exposed by Adam and Marcy's investigation, were swiftly removed from duty. As Emily reviewed the case files in her office that night, her phone buzzed with another message. "You can't stop what's coming." She stared at the screen, her resolve unwavering. "Yes, I can," she said quietly to herself. Emily sat at her desk, staring at the mountain of evidence that had consumed her life for months. The precinct was quieter now, the frantic energy of Carter's arrest giving way to a cautious calm. Hale's network was in shambles, his top enforcer and key collaborators behind bars. Yet, Emily knew their fight wasn't over. The public demanded accountability. Councilman Gregory Downs, the most prominent figure implicated in the operation, had gone into hiding after the evidence against him leaked. His resignation was inevitable, but Emily wasn't satisfied with that. Resignation wasn't justice. "Any word on Downs?" Emily asked, looking up as Adam entered her office. "Nothing yet," Adam said, shutting the door behind him. But Marcy tracked a series of encrypted communications between Downs and one of Hale's lawyers. "Looks like he's trying to negotiate a deal to flee the country." Emily leaned forward, her jaw tightening. "We can't let that happen. If he gets away, it'll undermine everything we fought for." Adam nodded. "I've already alerted the feds. They're keeping tabs on the airports, but Downs is slippery. We need to pressure him publicly, make it impossible for him to hide." Emily's mind raced. Public pressure was their best option, but it had to come from the people who had suffered the most under Hale's schemes. The community needed to take the lead. That afternoon, Emily visited Maria Torres, one of the first residents to speak out against the corruption. Maria's temporary apartment was modest but clean, with her children playing quietly in the next room. Maria greeted Emily at the door, her expression wary but kind. "Agent Reed, what brings you here?" Emily stepped inside, her tone gentle but direct. "Maria, I need your help. Downs is trying to run. If he succeeds, he'll escape justice for everything he's done to this community. But if the people demand accountability, we can stop him." Maria folded her arms, her gaze steady. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to speak at a rally," Emily said. "Bring others who've been affected. Your voices carry more weight than mine ever could. If the city sees the faces of the people Downs hurt, they won't let him get away." Maria hesitated, her eyes flickering to the room where her children played. "It's risky," she said softly. "He's powerful. What if he retaliates?" Emily placed a hand on Maria's arm, her voice firm. "He's losing power every day. This is the moment to act, to show him and everyone like him that this community won't be silenced." After a long pause, Maria nodded. "All right, I'll do it." Over the next 24 hours, word spread throughout the neighborhoods Hale and Downs had targeted. Flyers appeared on street corners, and social media lit up with calls for action. The rally was set to take place outside City Hall, where the press would be waiting. By the time the sun began to set the next evening, hundreds of people had gathered. Families, young professionals, activists, and displaced residents filled the plaza, holding signs with messages like "Justice for our communities" and "Downs must resign." Emily stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Maria took the microphone. "My name is Maria Torres," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "I lived in a home that my family worked hard to build. But Mason Hale and Gregory Downs didn't see a home, they saw a target. They used intimidation and lies to push us out, just like they did to so many others." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger palpable but focused. "We're not criminals. We're mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. And we deserve justice," Maria continued. "Councilman Downs, if you're listening, know this: you can't hide from us. You will answer for what you've done." Cheers erupted as more speakers took the stage, each sharing their stories of loss and resilience. Emily felt a swell of pride and gratitude for the courage these people showed. As the rally continued, a group of reporters cornered Emily near the edge of the crowd. "Agent Reed," one of them said, shoving a microphone toward her, "do you believe this rally will lead to Councilman Downs' arrest?" Emily kept her tone measured. "The people here today are shining a light on a system that tried to silence them. Their voices are powerful, and they've already made a difference. I believe justice will prevail, but it's going to take all of us working together to ensure that. Another reporter asked, "Do you feel safe? Downs associates have made threats against you personally. Are you worried about retaliation?" Emily straightened her shoulders. "I knew the risks when I started this job, but if we let fear stop us, we allow corruption to thrive. I won't stop fighting for justice, no matter the threats." The rally stretched late into the night, and by the end, news outlets across the city were broadcasting live footage. The pressure on Downs was undeniable, and just before midnight, Emily received the call she'd been waiting for. "He's in custody," said the federal agent on the other end of the line. "We picked him up trying to board a private plane. He's being brought in now." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, relief washing over her. "Good work. Let me know when he's processed. I want to be there." The next morning, Emily stood in the observation room as Gregory Downs was escorted into an interrogation room. His suit was rumpled, his once confident demeanor replaced by visible frustration. Emily didn't enter the room. This wasn't her interrogation to lead, but she watched as federal agents presented him with the evidence they had compiled. By the time she left, she knew Downs would face charges that would end his career and likely lead to significant prison time. Later that day, Emily returned to the neighborhoods she had fought so hard to protect. Families were moving back into their homes, repairs were underway, and a sense of hope was returning to the community. Maria approached her on the sidewalk, her children in tow. "You did it?" Maria said, her voice filled with gratitude. "No," Emily replied, shaking her head. "We did it. You and everyone else who stood up made this possible." Maria smiled. "Thank you for fighting for us." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "It's what I'm here for." That evening, Emily returned home. For the first time in months, her house felt like a sanctuary again. She sat on her porch, sipping tea and watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Her phone buzzed with a message from Adam. "Great work today. Let's celebrate soon." Emily smiled, replying simply, "Absolutely." As she leaned back in her chair, the weight of the case began to lift. There was still work to be done. There always would be. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Justice had prevailed, and the power of resilience, community, and hope had carried the day. Thank you for joining us on this journey through The Turning Point, a story of resilience, justice, and the power of community. If you were inspired by Emily's fight for justice and the courage of those who stood with her, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who value powerful storytelling. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine a light on perseverance, kindness, and hope. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue creating meaningful content. Together, let's keep celebrating the strength of the human spirit. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next story.